Hey guys, so this is the Period 5 lecture video. I'm just going to go through the PowerPoint from start to finish for all of Period 5, skipping past some of the in-class activities are kind of embedded throughout, so feel free to move forward, jump ahead to the parts that you want to hear, but I'm just going to go through the PowerPoint and go through the entire notes section. So I'm going to share my screen. There you go. Get this up out of the way here. All right. I'll put myself in the corner so you can see and hear me. All right, so period 5, 1848 to 1877. So again, the reason why College Board likes to begin with this start date, there is always a reason. There is a some kind of event that bookends this time period. What we're going to go into in the beginning of this unit is the westward expansion section, and we're going to see that there is something significant in terms of 1848 that has to do with westward expansion and how westward expansion also then will lead into the Civil War and then Reconstruction. There is a reason why all of this is grouped together, and they chose this point. It's not in period 4, it's part of period 5 for some reason. So that just kind of keep that in the back of our minds for now. Okay. So we began the unit with this quote that's in your book by John O'Sullivan, and it is speaking to this larger concept of the United States' ideology towards westward expansion at this time. And we wanted to highlight this painting in particular, so American Progress by John Gass. It is very synonymous with this concept of westward expansion and, again, the American perception of it. And this painting is synonymous with the big buzzword for the unit that we're about to talk about, which is manifest destiny. You can see how this angel, this godlike figure, is leading the American people out west in that direction of the painting. And with it, she is clearly in support of the technology that's coming with, she's pulling alongside of her. She's bringing in the light, driving out the darkness and the bad. So this is putting kind of God's positive stamp of approval on the American progress, which would be going out west, and interpreting that with it, we are bringing all this positive civilization and everything that comes with it, American values, all that jazz. So what is a manifest destiny if we have to put like a good textbook definition to it? So manifest destiny is this popular belief at the time by many Americans, as we'll see later, that it's not just the government, but also American people believe that the U.S. had this divine right and this mission to expand our borders west, basically from sea to shining sea. That it's the natural next step of our progression to take it over. And because of all of our good fortune as a country, that could be a sign of God's good faith, so many things. So there are a lot of factors that could potentially build towards this perception of America that this is our destiny. And a lot of it is stuff stemming from period 4. So in period 4, we talked a lot about nationalism, this pride and patriotism that America is experiencing post-War of 1812. And when you feel a lot of pride in your country, a lot of patriotism, that can make you feel justified in kind of everything that you're doing. You want to do what's best for your nation, and westward expansion and building the empire, getting new resources, all of that would obviously feed into that pro-nationalism. Population increase. This can work in twofold ways. So first, you just need more living space. And so westward expansion would obviously accommodate that. But also population increase specifically with in the flow of immigrants. These will be a huge part of the workforce that allows westward expansion to happen because they are going to be responsible for building the canals, laying the railroad tracks, all that stuff. So rapid economic development is also tied into the first industrial revolution from period 4, and how industrialization allows us to feed the machine in terms of we can use this technology to conquer that new Wild West territory, again, like with the more efficient railroad tracks, building canals, all that kind of stuff. But also, because of the first industrial revolution, it incentivizes us to go out west because we need those resources. So again, kind of a twofold development. So technological advances is kind of what I just hinted at. It just kind of builds it into the one above it. And last one is reform ideals. I know that saying the second antebellum, or the second Great Awakening and the antebellum reforms has anything to do with westward expansion sounds a little out there, but it really does, because the underlying kind of theme that Americans, like the common American experience during the time of the Second Great Awakening and the antebellum reforms, was the sense of empowerment. And the fact that if you don't like your life, you have the power to change it, or you can help improve other people's lives. It's within you to save your soul. All of these senses of empowerment really can help motivate that sense of westward expansion, because it could be a fresh start for people. It could be land for plantations to feed your personal wealth. All these things, it just people feel more. I want to say like entitled, but empowered is probably the best word. That even that stuff had nothing to do with westward expansion. Ideologically, there is a through line to it. Okay, so the first major example of manifest destiny is going to happen with this long history with Texas. So this is going to be a multi-step process of how Texas becomes part of the U.S. So Texas has switched hands in terms of its ownership over the years. Before, when this was a Spanish territory, Spanish colony, it was owned by the Spanish. When Mexico won its War of Independence, then it became a Mexican territory. However, even though it's largely switched hands, it has been left to its own devices. It's not as settled as the Mexican government would like it to be. It can be really good for farmland and ranching. And so they want to get the land up and moving. And so the Mexican government actually offered to the people of the United States that if they would like to cross the border and kind of plant their roots into Texas, and they can use it for plantations, whatever they need, just to get the land up and moving and part of the economy. So it would kind of be a win-win situation for the citizens who need that land and for the Mexican government. Stephen Austin, as in Austin, Texas, is the American that really encouraged that Texas settlement. So another kind of like Southern Democrat who believes that this is that boost that the Southern agricultural American dream needed. So it's going to be largely slave owners, cotton planters that are going into that area. However, the Mexican government did not anticipate the eagerness of the Americans to settle in that land. And by 1830, Americans outnumbered the Mexicans living in the area 3-1. But this is also American citizens plus their slaves. But still, that is a really big number in such a short amount of time. And so the Mexican government wanted to de-incentivize the migration that's happening into Texas. And so they started to put more restrictions in that area, limit the amount of immigration, outlaw slavery, because to them, slavery has already been banned. They don't believe it is in alignment with their Catholic beliefs. And they also say that people should convert or practice Catholicism when living in Mexico. So Americans are going to ignore all of these rules and continue their migration into the Texas area. So the Americans living in Texas now lead a revolution to become an independent nation. So this is not the Mexicans that live in Texas, it's the Americans that live in Texas. And again, when you think of the audacity of that, I think the example I give in class is that's like if a bunch of Canadians moved into New York and then decided to have a revolution and now just make it an independent nation. But it's of Canada, like of Canadians mainly. That would be like us as Americans would kind of raise our eyebrows at that. That's pretty much how the Mexican government feels about this situation, that the audacity of the Americans living in this area just are fighting for independence of any kind. It seems silly to them. So General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is like one of the Mexican generals at this time, who is in contrast to Sam Houston, who's an American living in Texas. So Sam Houston is in what we call Houston, Texas, who's really leading this revolution. And he actually becomes the first official president of Texas when it becomes independent. This is also where we get the famous Battle of the Alamo, where a lot of people essentially it almost kind of goes into like martyrdom for the Alamo. It's like enshrined in history as like, remember the Alamo, remember these people who fought for their beliefs so hard. And this becomes like a big rallying cry for other Southerners, even Southerners who don't live in Texas, rally behind this idea of the Alamo as part of their history because they fought for their beliefs. Something that we can kind of see another through line to when we get to the Civil War and how Southerners today also remember the Civil War like in almost a fond manner, whereas other people might question that that legacy. Okay, so let me move me down here to the corner so you can see this. All right, so Sam Houston is now the official president of Texas, the Republic of Texas, and he applies for statehood to the United States government. He wants Texas to become incorporated into America. And this, going back into the 1830s, was actually under the time of Jackson. And Jackson didn't want to touch it. And Martin Van Buren, the next president, didn't want to touch it. And then even John Tyler, the next president, is a Southerner. He didn't want to lose the opportunity. He was hesitant. There's a lot of primary sources that show his hesitancy to take it, but he does begin the process because he doesn't want to miss the opportunity. And I think it's really telling that you have all these Southern Democrats as president who would love to jump on the opportunity to have more land, all show this hesitancy because they understand what it could do. They understand the foreign policy implications of this, and they understand the potential for this to open up more political debates around the issue of slavery, as which we'll talk about later. So I think it's very telling that these are Southern Democrats who are supposed to be so gung-ho on westward expansion show this hesitancy. I think it speaks volumes. So the next president, James Polk, is the big pro-expansionist president. Like, his name is synonymous with Manifest Destiny at this time. And so he's the one we're going to focus on. He's the one who kind of wrapped up the annexation of Texas and then will continue onward. So a lot of this is centered around his presidency. So he was very pro-expansionist, very vocal about the annexation of Texas. And so the fact that he was elected, I think, broadcasts to us as historians that most of America agree with him, that they're kind of in the same thought process because they elected a pro-expansionist president. They support that ideology. And so Texas does become part of the United States. And the Mexican government is understandably pissed. They feel like we played like the long con, and like this was a goal for us to kind of take Texas out from under them in the end, which, again, when you look at it from their perspective, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. And so we're going to put a pin in that for now, as you know, this tension is brewing between us and Mexico. I want to highlight one other instance of Manifest Destiny from our books, which is Oregon. And I'll tell you why I want to talk about this one over all the other little border disputes. Why Oregon? So what's happening in Oregon is that Great Britain owns British Canada right now. And so we are trying to discern what is going to be the northern border of the United States between us and Canada. And those Manifest Destiny ideals really come to light with the American public creating this rallying cry, this chant called 5440 or fight, meaning that the line of latitude that should decide what the northern border of the United States should be would be the 5440 line, which would actually be where the red ends up here. So a much larger chunk of Canada would have been incorporated into the United States if the American public got their way. But they were willing to fight Great Britain for this piece of land. Now, this doesn't actually come to fruition. Polk negotiates the 49th parallel, which is the modern border, which is that red line. So we treaty it out, basically. And the reason for that is because we have bigger fish to fry. This is happening in the background with all this stuff going on with Texas and Mexico. And so he wants to set his sights more on there. So we negotiate this. But I think it is so telling. The reason why that's a golden term, the 5440 or fight, is because it tells us that it's not just the American government that is very land hungry. The American people also support this ideology. Just like the election of Polk, this is a key indicator what the public, like what the pulse of the nation was at the time. So in terms of going out west, a couple other things I wanted to highlight in those early topics of your book. I wanted to clarify what the Great American Desert was, what that term means. It doesn't mean the literal desert. It's literally the whole middle third of the United States that we are slowly migrating into. We own most of this land. Well, now we own Texas as well. So we have all this land. It's just largely unsettled. And so it's called the desert just because it's the unknown. We don't know what's out there. We've had this land, some of it even for a while from the Louisiana Purchase. We just haven't had the ability, the money, the technology, the government support, all of these factors that make that westward expansion possible and safe. And early people who go out are what we call like mountain men, these men who kind of venture out on their own and carve out these trails, which we get like the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, California Trail, the Mormons who flee out to Utah because of their persecution. These early kind of mountaineers who carve these paths, which are still very dangerous to do, mind you, and very expensive to hire one of these people. So it's not gonna, this is not the middle class adventure that a lot of people like to make it out to be. That's kind of a romanticized version of the American dream. But people will start to use these trails to migrate out. But it's a slow process. Some of the three groups that are really going to move out there right now are farmers, ranchers, and miners. Those are the three demographics. And we'll explore that a little bit more in period 6, because we're going to get distracted now with the Civil War. But you have miners starting to flee out to the west, like California and the Black Hills and Dakotas for the gold rush. We have farmers who want homesteads, you know, for their crops. And then we also have ranchers who need the wide space for herding animals and domesticating animals. Something else we'll talk about a little bit more in the beginning of period 6 is how the processes of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, how they are so intertwined with each other and perpetuate each other. So we'll put a pin in that right now and revisit that in period 6, but I wanted to mention it here because it is a takeaway that the book does put forth right now. So then in the class, you guys, took the time to revisit this idea of sectionalism, which I'm about to, or I'm going to go into again in a little bit, just revisiting the different regions and their histories and what their viewpoints are and their values before we go into the Civil War. But we're not quite there yet. One of the major things that they are going to disagree on is westward expansion and the handling and the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. So this is a very short war, 1846 to 1848. Now, I forgot to mention this earlier in the video. We are already now, because we had to go a little bit back into the 30s to talk about Texas. But where did that 1848 beginning time period start for this unit? You can see it is the Mexican-American War. Like this seems to be the event and the conclusion of it, which is the catalyst for period 5. So what is really going on here, and why does it set in motion the Civil War unit? So 1846 to 1848, very short war, sometimes commonly referred to as Mr. Polk's War. And there's an activity you guys did in class, the Mexican Tea Party activity here, where you guys acted as different people to kind of get this perspective of what was the pulse again of the nation at the time and how do they feel about the war. If you look at primary sources from the time and what the media puts out at the time and Congress and the president, the vibe that is portrayed is the American public overwhelmingly supports westward expansion and going to war with Mexico. However, that is really challenged now by modern historians when you look at different types of groups and minority groups and different regions of the United States, and not just American citizens, but Mexican citizens and people who have migrated between the countries. And there's so many more perspectives. And they agree or disagree with the war for both economic, political, and social reasons. So there's a wide range. But why it's called Mr. Polk's War, it's hinting at that idea that it's not the people's war. It is one man's kind of agenda for whatever reason to fight this war. And we'll kind of get that why people have that impression more so in a second. But if you see in a primary source, Mr. Polk's War, they're referring to the Mexican-American War. And that's coming from someone who probably doesn't support it, because it means that that's not my war, that's his war. So the Mexican-American War, bring myself up again. All right, so Polk wants Mexico to sell California and New Mexico to him, which is this whole blue section of the United States. It's not the modern day states. We have to remember that they used these terms earlier, these state names earlier, before they were carved out as the modern day states. So it's really that whole blue section. And the Mexican government is like, oh my God, the audacity of the Americans who just annexed Texas out from under us are now asking us to sell, and it was for a lowball offer, this whole other portion of our nation to them. So they're like, get out of here. Like, no, we're not going to even entertain this at all. So that tension is still rising. You can see how that is a priority for President Polk to get that land. And now we're going to swing back to Texas, because as you can see in the map, there's this disputed area, a huge chunk of disputed area between us and Mexico. We cannot decide between our two governments what is the natural border of Texas. Is it the the Rio Grande River, which would be this lower border here, which if you're an American, you would say, yeah, it's the Rio Grande River, because that would give you this entire disputed land. But if you're a Mexican, you would say that it's the Rio Grande River. Or not the Rio Grande, it's the Nueces River, which is this one up here. That's the natural border, which would then put all that into Mexican territory. And so there's kind of, again, this long buildup of tension between us and the Mexican government. And President Polk makes a bold move, which historians today have now investigated maybe a little bit more, seen some more primary sources from the president and his cabinet of his intentions that weren't maybe publicly stated as to why he did this next move. He sent General Zachary Taylor, so one of his generals, just to march into the disputed territory, not to do anything, but just to station there. And if you are part of the Mexican government or the Mexican citizens, you are now seeing the American military being ordered into your nation and then stationed there. So if you're looking at this from the other perspective, it looks like a sign of aggression. And then they retaliate with force against the American military. And so President Polk uses that as justification to declare war on the Mexican government. So we are now in an open war with Mexico over this disputed territory. Now, the primary sources that I alluded to earlier that talk about maybe Polk's intentions off screen would be the fact that in history, when nations fight each other and treaties are formed, the winner sometimes ends up with more land. Like that is a common earning, post-war. And so because Mexico refused to acknowledge that this land is ours or sell us this land, that potentially going to war with them would be able to successfully secure that land for America. And that is the reason why he may have instigated this war, because there was no other reason to march necessarily into that disputed territory. So another reason why it's called Mr. Polk's War. Okay, so fast forward to the end of the war. So U.S. wins the war with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. All right, we're at that year. So this treaty is kind of a huge land grab for the United States. It's kind of like the next phase, like the first land deal that we ever had, the first major one was Louisiana Purchase. This, and then the annexation of Texas may have been like a smaller one there. But then this is the next largest one. Between Louisiana Purchase and these are our two big land deals in American history. So what did this say? Well, it solidified the southern border as Rio Grande. So we get the disputed territory, which if you can kind of like look at the bottom of Texas, it resembles our modern day border. And then the U.S. gets what we call the Mexican Cession, which is all that land in blue. The land we originally tried to pay for, also known as New Mexico and California. So the Mexican Cession just means that you have to like give something to someone. Like a concession is, you're buying food at a concession stand, but a cession is like something that's released to someone. So the Mexican Cession is the land that they have to give up. We do give them $15 million for it though. And I know students, when they hear that, might question like, why? Because we won it. Honestly, some of the best reason is to lay claim to it. Like, so the Mexican government doesn't feel like they have any authority, like I said, any claim to that land anymore. Like this is ours, it's officially purchased, even though that's not a ton of money for it. That's kind of the deal with that. So how did the Americans feel? Well, the Northern Whigs, so again, the people who were Federalists and are opposition to the Southern Democrats, oppose all this because they understand, just like the Louisiana Purchase, they understand that getting more land can benefit the nation in certain ways. But they recognize the major con or drawback to every time we get new land is that it reopens this debate about slavery. It rehashes this open wound that they just understand the political mess that's going to happen. And especially because this land is in the southern part of the United States, it was acquired by a pro-slave, pro-expansionist president, that land would most likely go toward in that direction. And now when you look at the balance between northern free states that promote industry and pro-government, like pro-central government, all those other ideologies that come along with that, versus the amount of southern agricultural slave-owning states that are pro-states' rights, they're going to get outnumbered. So it's not even just like, oh, we don't like the expansion of slavery. It's you have to really think of it in terms of like slavery and slave owners tend to be aligned with agricultural people who tend to be aligned Democrat. And then those people have other political values, associated with that. And so it's the adding more slave states to the union. It's not necessarily because they're like afraid of increasing slavery or like they want to do away with slavery. It is because that balance of power in terms of Democrat versus Whig that comes along with the alignment if you're pro or anti-slavery. And so in order to kind of chop off that, at the tip, is that the like right from the get-go, the Whigs in Congress submit the Wilmot Proviso for approval. The Wilmot Proviso was the Whigs' attempt at banning slavery in the Mexican Cession from the get-go, which if you were a Southern Democrat, you probably wouldn't take too kindly to that. So not only does it not pass, but it basically confirms the Southern Democrats' worst fears that the Northern Whigs want to touch slavery, like they want to abolish it. Again, that's not really what's going on here. That's not really what's being proposed. They just want to limit its expansion into this territory. But you can imagine how that can inflame the Southern Democrats into thinking that, like, oh my gosh, they're going to come after our slaves. Like, this is where this is heading. And so it puts them more on edge. It heightens tensions between the two political parties. Okay, so let's go back and review some of the sectionalism that's happening. So let's go back and review what is North versus South and then a little bit of West. The history of these regions, their values. So when we go into the Civil War, we can understand, where they're coming from and why they are disagreeing on these different issues. So to understand that, I'm going to go back to the beginning. You can really trace the origins of the Civil War all the way from colonization, because right at the get-go from colonization, whether you landed in the North or the South, that predetermined your economy based on the climate and geography. So because the North had rocky terrain and cold winters, they turned more to trading and fishing, furs, industry, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the South, because they had warm air, fertile soil, all that stuff, they turn more to agriculture. And because of that climate and geography difference, or differentiated their economies, that is really the key issue for how you see every other issue going forward. How your economy is set up changes your perspective of how you feel about tariffs and a national bank and how big the federal government should be, all those things, because if it benefits your economy and how you make money or not, that's the key issue here. So let's kind of continue through history. So you have industry versus agriculture, North and South. Then you go to the Revolution. Well, who was more pro-revolution and fought more in the Revolution? It was the North. It was because their economy was the one that was mainly being hit by the taxation and the navigation acts. The South, because they're agricultural based, relied way more on Great Britain because they were their main buyer for their products and relied on them way more economically. And so they were less incentivized to rebel. So now we can see how that's affecting the revolution unit. Then we get into post-revolution, we're a new nation. And as I said before, how you are in terms of your economy affects how you feel about tariffs, because the North was way more self-sufficient with their creation of factories and manufacturing, and they're just more self-sustainable, whereas the South relied on imports significantly, therefore anti-tariff. They don't like taxing on imports. And then you have the National Bank. Well, a national bank is more likely to give out loans to big businesses that are more located in the North, not small town farmers. That's a risky business that are located in the South. And so you can see again how your economy is set up is really affecting how you feel about all these things. Even how much power the federal government should be is an issue about your economy. Because if at this time, I know this is not the modern perspective of it, but back then, people or business people liked the federal government involvement because at this time, the federal government didn't put on restrictions to business. If anything, they really supplemented and incentivized and supported business in whatever way they can. We'll talk about this a little bit more in period 6 as well. But I know that's not kind of the thought today. The thought today is a lot of business people are anti-government and because now involvement today means regulation. Back then, that was not the idea. And so again, how your economy is set up really determines how you feel about government involvement and all the other economic issues. And then with the Industrial Revolution, it just further perpetuated that difference between the two regions because the North revolutionized their industry and were able to diversify more and went into mass production, whereas the South just dug their heels even more into agriculture and slavery and did not feel the need to diversify because they could depend on the North for that kind of stuff or import it. Like there was no need because every economy, the North and the South and the West, even different states could specialize in whatever they needed to and import things using canals and railroads. So the industrialization helped expand our economy, but also stunt it at the same time, depending on the region you're talking about. And then lastly, over here, this antebellum era, every time we have this new land opening up, whether that be Louisiana Purchase or now the Mexican Cession, there is always, the next question is always, is it going to be free or slave? So it always opens up that debate. And so far, the federal government has been the one to make that call and slap the Band-Aids on it like the Missouri Compromise. But we start to see in the antebellum era, the Second Great Awakening and the antebellum reforms inspired by that, we started seeing these early abolitionists. Now, this is a minority group of abolitionists who are starting to use their power, whether it be, literature or political power or just physically revolting to try to abolish slavery. But again, you can understand how that, like the Wilmot Proviso, just validates all of these fears from the South that the North is gunning for their slaves or the government's going to come for their slaves eventually. So it's just further separating these two regions. All right, so let's talk about these different regions. So let's talk about the North. The North really has two separate regions in and of itself. We have the original New England area, so the Northeast, which is in red up here, which is different than the later Northwest. They have some similarities and some differences, so we want to talk about that because when it gets to the Civil War, there's a reason why the entire North will band together despite their differences. So the New England area, the original Northwest, is very industrial. That's where a lot of the manufacturing and trade and industry is occurring. That's where a lot of the urbanization, so the large major cities are forming. Transportation stems out from here. All railroads are kind of leaning back to New York, it feels like, because this is the beginning. All canals are trying to come back to this area and connect the other parts of the nation. So this is really like the heart of the economy right now. And a lot of the population, whereas the Northwest came later, after the Revolution and the Articles of Confederation tried to orchestrate some ways to carve out these states and incentivize people going out there by selling off the land. So the Northwest is like a mixture of the North and the South in terms of its economy. It's got a good amount of agriculture, like the South, but they're still slowly creating those major cities. This is where we get Columbus and Chicago starting to be created. They want to become a little bit more like the North. So they're kind of half. They're the best of both worlds. So we can see like the canals and the railroads, they're being built from the Northeast and they're being connected through the Northwest. So the Northwest is following suit, but it is a lot of agriculture as well. But they do not have slaves. And that's what that Northwest Ordinance, part of that path to statehood that set up, outlawed slavery from the get-go there. So again, they are really an amalgamation between the North and the South. But one other thing they have in common is the immigrant population is really dispersed throughout all of the North, depending on where they want to come and where they want to settle. So starting in the 1820s, we have what we call the first wave of immigration. The second one's going to be closer to 1900. Both waves are going to be, the causes and effects are going to be very similar. And I'm sure you can understand like the causes and effects are similar throughout all immigration in world history. There are push and pull factors that we're not going to talk so much about the push factors, why they left their home. We're going to focus more on why did they come to America? What were the pull factors here? And then what is their experience when they arrive here? And how do they change the fabric of society? So in terms of understanding who's coming here and when, and why, we're looking at, this is a really good infographic to show that the two main populations, the two big demographics are the Irish and Germans. And where they're coming into port cities, which a lot of the ports are located in the New England area for trading. And so they're going to come here and they're either going to stay in major cities because that's where the factory work is, or they're going to go out west to start their own homesteads. A lot of Germans will do that as well. Irish actually tend to stay in the large cities and congregate with each other. But you can see that they're not going to the south because there's no job opportunities. All of the workers are slaves. So there's literally no reason for them to go down there. And that's actually why to this day, a lot of immigrants and populations are still concentrated in northern cities. The South is still not super, in comparison to the North, diverse even to this day. So again, just to briefly talk about the push factors, and like why they're able to come now of all times. They have maybe failed democratic revolutions in their home countries, poor economies, religious persecution, all these things, famine, and so just hardships in general. And why they're able to come over now, on top of the reasons why they're leaving now, but their migration is supported by the revolution, the industrial revolution that's happening around the world. So the creation of the ocean liners, essentially, this ocean transportation makes it more efficient, more affordable, that can bring over mass amounts of people at the same time. And they're coming to America because of our history of political and economic and religious freedom. Like, we were a beacon for that at this time. However, we'll look at their experience when they get here and if that really holds up. So what is the experience of these people? So the Irish are the majority of the immigrants coming over, and they're going to have a rougher time than the Germans. And that's because the Germans are going to come over and they're going to have a little bit more money in their pocket, a little bit more skill, and there's just less stereotypes about them at the time. Whereas Irish are battling poverty. I mean, both groups are Catholic, but for like the Irish just get a lot more heat during this time. Also, just because they're more illiterate, so just less skilled. But also, there's a stereotype of them being kind of drunk brutes, as you can see in this political cartoon up here of how the Irishman is portrayed as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon woman or the English woman. This is also a picture from a medical journal at the time where you can see it's a little bit cut off because of my computer. Oh, there's. So in the middle, you can see how the Anglo-Saxon man is drawn. On the left, you can see the Irishman's profile. On the right, you can see the African slave's profile. And the big takeaway of this is that it is separating them, like, biologically, genetically, Irish from English. But you can see how the Irish are also depicted closely to the African slave, because at this time they are making the medical biological argument that the Irish are Black and therefore should be not, I mean, some areas of the world will try to enslave the Irish people, but they're going to face a lot of discrimination because this medical journal is essentially justifying discriminating against them because of their genetic relation or proximity to an uncivilized, uneducated slave, essentially. So it is wild to think that in the first census that the country is creating, which is around this time, that Irish people were actually under the status of Black. So what is the experience of the people who come here? Let me move myself down here in the corner. So their experience is they're going to face a lot of pushback, especially the Irish. So many native-born Americans do not like the sudden influx of immigrants. A lot of the arguments are probably the same ones that exist today. So you can imagine what some of those are without me having to go into so many of them. But there are two terms that you will need to know for the argument's sake at this time before we revisit this in period 6. This word nativism, this buzzword that we're going to talk about all the way up through the modern time. But nativism is when you prefer native-born people over foreigners. So it's just anti-foreigners. So it's different than like xenophobia, which is like the fear of other races. Nativism is specifically for immigrants. And there are so many nativists that are they're forming in opposition to the Irish and Germans that are coming over that they actually form their own political party called the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party is a political party that it has to keep their dealings secret. And so if you were to approach them and ask them about what they're doing about their platform, their anti-immigrant platform, they have to respond with "we know nothing," which is so sketchy. But everyone knows what they stand for. They have a flag. This is their flag in the corner. Native Americans beware of foreign influence. It's just the fact that they have almost like KKK like aspect to them, where they would use physical intimidation and scare tactics against the immigrants at the time. It had that very similar vibe to it, just not nearly to the extent that the KKK will. I don't want to like totally make a side by side comparison to that, but you can kind of understand what their the gist of it was if you can kind of understand how the KKK later comes about as well. But yeah, so we have this political party that's forming, and so the state of the immigrants at this time aren't going to affect the outcome, like the Civil War part of this unit. As we go into that, we're not going to talk about immigrants anymore, but we're going to revisit it immediately in period 6 because they're going to shape the post-war era a lot. Okay, so the South. There's not a whole lot of new stuff for the South. I want you guys to understand that that phrase "cotton is king" or "King Cotton." It is initially a Southern pride term. Like, yeah, cotton, but then it kind of gets reappropriated by Northerners. So if you see it from a perspective of a Northerner, if they say King Cotton, it's almost like a jab, because it's like, oh my gosh, you're so dependent on cotton. So depending on the context of where you're seeing that term, it can really be a positive or a negative. But the 3 things that really boost cotton production at this time is the invention of the cotton gin, as we talked about in period 4. Westward expansion is allowing more land to be planted, and industrialization. So as we're gonna get into this a little bit more in the unit, but industrialization in the North is incentivizing slavery in the South because one of the major exports in the North are textiles, which is clothing. And what do you need for textiles but cotton? And so the Northern textile mills are largely dependent on the slave um, labor in the South to pick that cotton and then it be transported up to them. So all of these things combined just are really perpetuating the demand for slavery. Some people even refer to it as a peculiar institution. Like there is a primary source that this is referencing, that it's popular for historians and for history classes to talk about it. But the peculiar institution was, I forget the politician off the top of my head, but when asked about slavery, he refers to it as the peculiar institution, which is a very like quaint way of sidestepping the horrors of slavery. And so it's what that's just reflective of or what that's indicative of is again how Southerners feel about slavery at the time. Like it's not a major issue. They are sidestepping it. They're like, oh, don't look at, don't look at this behind the curtain. It's a peculiar institution. Like they're really trying to downplay it as much as possible. And the Southern states just are not as industrial, as urbanized as the Northern states because they don't feel the need. But I do want to challenge some of the probably assumptions of the South at this time because I remember when I learned about this in history class, I assumed that every Southerner had a slave. Like that is really the interpretation that I was given. But the South doesn't. They still have that very rigid hierarchy that they had way back in the times of the Chesapeake area, with poor people at the top or bottom and rich at the top. And I mean, everywhere has that. But what's different is that there's no social mobility in the South. You are locked there for life. Social mobility, the ability to make something of yourself, get new job opportunities, whatever, that is really a Northern phenomenon because there's a lot of economic opportunities. The South, it is what it is. And 3/4 of the whites in the South are of low socioeconomic status. Like this pyramid should more so be like this. Like it's more of a Hershey's kiss. There's way more at the bottom than there is at the top. And the abolitionists at this time even point to that as how can you use the justification that the slaves are biologically or whatever inferior when 3/4 of the Southern population is also illiterate, not working, poor, can't sustain themselves? I mean, that's a really good argument. And so we'll talk about some of the uh, justifications, the rationale that slave owners will give in response to that. But those questions start getting, it's just one of the reasons why the Northerners can start looking at this like just start poking at it. Okay, so we're gonna pop ahead to the road to the Civil War. So I always think this is so funny because I really feel like the United States is like that couple that is like the North and South are always like the couple that like fight in front of everyone awkwardly at every party, and you just are like, why are they together? And then they somehow make up, and you're like, this isn't gonna last long. And so that's pretty much how it's felt like for the entirety of history. Because every time we've talked about the two parties disagreeing or fighting, that's really North versus South. Because as we talked about before, what party you're a part of is largely based on your economy, which is based on if you're in the North or the South. So that's just kind of the vibe that's happening so far. And we talked about how territorial expansion has opened up that debate about slavery with every new piece of land. The next question is it going to be a free or slave? And this is kind of just recapping everything we already talked about in the video. But the 4 causes of the Civil War, this is not written anywhere in your book. This is an acronym that I created to just help you remember the causes off the top of your head. I think it's nice to have an acronym to fall back on. So if you ever had to do a piece of writing about the causes of the Civil War, if you can remember PECs, because you need PECs to fight, then from there you can try to remember all of the events that could be sorted under these different categories. So like I just said, every instance that we're about to talk about on the road to the Civil War can be sorted under one or more of these categories. So P is just politics. And in particular, I'm talking about the extremists, like the fact that we have extremists in Congress, we have extremist presidents, we have extremist abolitionists or abolitionists, whatever. You just have people on both sides that are unwilling to compromise. Like tensions are at an all-time high. And then you have economic differences. That's what we talked about in the sectionalism section, that they've disagreed on so many other economic issues, but slavery is just such a key one that it's got like its own cause. Constitutional disputes is harking back to that age-old debate about interpretation of the Constitution, states' rights versus federal government power. So the idea of federalism, all that stuff is also going to come to a head, because what is the big state right that they're really trying to keep here? It's slavery. And I know a lot of people try to argue that states' rights is the cause for the Civil War, but the best way to contradict that or kind of pry a little further into that is, what is the state right they're fighting to keep? Because if it was just states' rights, look at all the stuff in number 2 at this point, like tariffs, banking, internal improvements, all this other stuff. The Alien and Sedition Acts that the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions tried to push back on. All like any other time that something similar has happened, the nullification crisis under Jackson with those tariffs. If it was really about states' rights, it really died down fast. We don't fight the Civil War over just states' rights. It is slavery in particular. And that's kind of what historians point to, who try to challenge that assertion that it was anything other than slavery. Because otherwise, if it was just states' rights, something else maybe would have happened by now. So let's get into it. So there are 2 big perspectives or buzzwords that you need to understand for this unit. The first is the Free Soil movement. The Free Soil movement is not abolitionist. Abolitionists want to abolish slavery everywhere. Free soilers are people who just want to limit the expansion of it into new territory. So these are everyone in the North. This unites the Northern Whigs, the pro-federal government industrial type people, as well as the Northern Democrats. What combines all these people together is that you are in Northern free states. So it's kind of this new ideology that actually crosses party line, but it's based on where you live. It's all of the North. And this is the precursor to the Republican Party. And the reason why they're not abolitionists is because these people, like, again, a major misconception at the time is that, like, I was taught this growing up too, is that Northerners really wanted to abolish slavery. They didn't support it. If they really didn't support it, it would have been abolished a long time ago. There's a lot of primary sources that support the fact that Southerners or Northerners did not feel the need to abolish it because they understood that their economy is also intertwined with the Southern one. There'd be a lot of job competition if you just freed millions of potential employees, and it would disrupt the entire flow of the economy. And they really just don't care as much. They can be racist too. And so they just want to limit its expansion because, like what I said before, we want to limit the political power of slave owning states. And that number of more Democratic versus Whig states, like that is really what it came down to for them. But the South is going to see any restriction on the potential of, slavery expanding as a a challenge to slavery everywhere. They're going to be on high alert. And it's going to be their challenge, like their constitutional right to own property. Like they're going to see this as a violation of like their Fourth Amendment. Another big buzzword for the unit is popular sovereignty, which is this idea that so far we've talked about that it's the federal government is making the decision if a state is made free or slave. Popular sovereignty is this new idea that based on what's popular, most accepted and liked by most people, will be sovereign. Like because when you turn sovereign when you're 18, like that's the example I like to give to describe what sovereignty means. It's like independence. So popular sovereignty is like in your ability to make your own decisions. Is that how about crazy concept? We allow the people who live in that state to vote, and majority would rule if that slave, if it would be a free or slave state. And so this is a new idea that's being proposed, and we're going to see how it's going to create more issues down the road, even though it sounds potentially way more democratic. So the Compromise of 1850, this is how the United States government, what they do with all the Mexican cession territory. And the reason why they have to figure out this land now is because specifically California, a lot of gold rush miners are moving out there. And so because it's becoming more populated, the government goes, oh crap, I cannot put off this issue for very much longer. We need to figure out what we're going to do with it. And so the Compromise of 1850, created by the compromiser in history, Henry Clay, comes up with California is going to be admitted as a free state. Part of that is also to contrast the fact that Texas was just admitted as a slave state. And then we're going to divide the remaining Mexican cession into two territories, Utah and New Mexico. So basically Utah is the new area here, because before it was all California and New Mexico. But both of those areas in purple are going to be divided or determined by popular sovereignty. So this is the first time popular sovereignty has been put on the table. It will not cause an issue right away because no one lives out there. That vote to determine if something is going to be free or slave will not happen for a while. So I wanted to clarify that. Popular sovereignty, yes, is being used here, not causing problems yet because no one lives there. But there's one other part of the Compromise of 1850 that flies under the radar a lot in a lot of like previous history classes, but for APUSH, it is a big part of this, the cause of the Civil War. It's a golden term. So we want to talk about what is this fugitive slave law, and why do people hate it so much? Why do Northerners hate it so much? And it's because there actually is a fugitive slave law written into the Constitution, which says that if you find a runaway slave, you have to return it to its owner. However, it's very ambiguous in terms of who it applies to. There's no punishment given for it. And so it's not really enforced. This now reestablishes another fugitive slave law, and it's going to be strictly enforced. It directly calls out that it applies to all of the states, including the North, and provides punishment for it. So this political cartoon of the time really encapsulates how the North feels about their being beholden to this fugitive slave law. They feel like they are dogs doing the dirty work of the South. They are, they have to go chase after their slaves, and they don't really have any control or say anymore. When you really think of it, the constitutional aspect, the constitutionality of the fugitive slave law, if you were a free state, like that is in your state constitution, that there's no slavery in your area. But now if an escaped slave runs away and crosses the border, you would assume that then that means that they're free because there is no slavery in your state. The fugitive slave law is basically saying, nope, once a slave, always a slave, and you need to return them. So not only does it make Northerners part of the slavery process, which they do not like, and it just puts more work on them as well, or they morally don't agree with it, whatever it is. Now it's making them have to be part of the process, and they're upset about that. But now you're really saying that slavery exists in that state. That's what that's really coming down to. There's really no such thing as a free state at that point. Now, there's some major literature on the road to the Civil War. The two big books are Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. That one is a big one. That is a golden term. The Impending Crisis of the South is like a secondary one, but you need to know Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe depicts the life of a slave. This is a bestseller in the North, and the primary reader is actually women. And if you go back to the antebellum reform period, if you remember, we talked about how women were largely a part of all the other reforms because they can empathize with the plight of others more at this time with the oppression. And so women were actually a key demographic and reader of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is where the moral argument against slavery starts to arise. It depicts the tragicness of a slave life and starts to make people question the morality of slavery. And so that's where we start to see this a turn there, and women maybe leading the abolitionist charge here. But the second book, The Impending Crisis of the South, takes an alternative approach. They go at it from an economic perspective. This author is basically using statistics and analytics to talk about how the Southern economy has been crippled because of their dependency on slaves, and how their transportation networks are underdeveloped, and they lack in urbanization, and population growth is stagnant, and they don't have as much technology, and just how their trajectory, if they keep on this, it's terrible, that their economy is going to suffer. And so the North, maybe you're not really buying into the moral argument against slavery, but you hear this economic argument and you start going, yeah, the South is, yeah, half the country dragging us down. And so it's just another way that the South is, or the North is getting a little bit, I don't know, woke about slavery. All right, now we get to where it really heats up. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is where the precursor to the Civil War, the first physical conflict erupts. And it's actually it all begins in Illinois. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois wants to build a transcontinental railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast that'll go through Chicago, it'll go through Illinois. So it'll help build up that urbanization and industrialization and all that kind of stuff. But you can't just ask the federal government to approve all of this funding for a transcontinental railroad that would only go through northern states, because the Southerners would never get on board with that. They don't benefit from it at all, but their tax dollars would help fund this. So what do you do to help them get on board with this? Well, he proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, him and some of the other people who follow this and want this to happen. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. It goes back and repeals the Missouri Compromise that had already predetermined how slavery was going to be handled in the Missouri Compromise area, or sorry, the Louisiana Purchase territory. So Missouri Compromise made, Missouri slave, Maine free, and then it arbitrarily drew that line at the 3630 line of latitude, which is roughly here at the top border of Kansas. And everything, any state that would be eventually carved out of that territory, north of it would be automatically free. Anything south of it would be automatically slave. He just ripped that Band-Aid off. That was keeping a Band-Aid on the issue of slavery in that area for a while. And now he opens up both those territories to popular sovereignty, Kansas and Nebraska. So why would the South be interested in this? This is the trade-off for the Transcontinental Railroad, because now area that was previously off limits to slavery now has the potential to become slave-owning states north of that 3630 line. Now, this is where we start seeing popular sovereignty cause problems, because no one's living in Nebraska right now. No one's living in Utah or New Mexico, where popular sovereignty has also been decided. But people are starting to move into Kansas. It's the closest. It's already been a little bit more populated. And so it becomes like a race to Kansas. Northern Whigs and Southern Democrats both rush to Kansas so they can become Kansas citizens and be part of that voting on if it's going to be free or slave. Even like governments, like there's the New England Immigrant Aid Society is like a group that purposely funded people like Northerners, anti-slavery Northerners, to move to Kansas to be part of this. And like the Southerners also call the other Southerners who jump in, they call them like border ruffians, because they're just like hopping the border into Kansas. And so you have all these groups who are rushing to Kansas, and it becomes a full-out physical brawl in Kansas. It's like a mini civil war in Kansas over popular sovereignty, because the two different groups are there and they know why they're there. So they're in open conflict with each other. They set up two different governments in two different parts of the states, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, create two different state constitutions, and they just refuse to recognize each other. And the rest of the country is looking at them, or looking at the federal government like, are you going to step in here? Are you going to do something? And the federal government just goes, we're going to let them handle it. They're going to figure it out. They just turn a blind eye and allow Kansas to descend into madness, which is what Bleeding Kansas refers to, is this open conflict that the federal government is just going to allow to continue to happen. Now, more extremists in politics, this time in Congress, the Sumner Brooks incident. So this is, and during a congressional meeting, Senator Sumner, who is a Northern Whig, he's actually going to become a very big pro-North person in Reconstruction later. So you're going to recognize his name again later. But Senator Sumner of the North, he does this very slanderous anti-South speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he's basically saying what's happening in Kansas right now, Bleeding Kansas, is all of the Southern Democrats, the slave owners' fault. They're the reason why this conflict is happening, because they just can't let go of their slaves. And literally in the middle of his argument, this old man, Senator Brooks, starts running up and starts attacking him and beating him with his own cane. So there's a brawl on the congressional floor, which is insane. Like if that happened today, that'd be wild. So you get this political cartoon up here at the top, the Southern chivalry argument. So Southern chivalry again it's a jab, it's a joke. This is obviously not. There's nothing chivalrous about punching someone else in the face. But you can understand how that's being used as propaganda now against the Southerners, like, oh my God, look, they're barbaric in Kansas and now they're barbaric in Congress. And so based on everything we've talked about to this part, or to this point, this is where we get the birth of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was born with a single-mindedness to stop the expansion of slavery. The Free Soil movement has now become a political party in the Republican Party. Again, not to abolish it everywhere, but to stop the spread of it. The goal will eventually turn into abolitionism, but that's not that game right now. We'll talk about why they pivot later. But that is why the Republican Party was created today, to stop the expansion of slavery. So it is a conglomerate of a lot of different groups, people who identified as free soilers, Whigs, and Democrats who are in the North. What is the common thread? They are all Northerners. They all do not have slaves. So the Republican Party really just cut the country in half into a full-on new political party, whereas the Northwest area that was largely agricultural could really flip-flop between the two parties. And maybe actually more of them leaned like the Southern Democrats because they were more agricultural in general. Not anymore. Slavery has now drove them to side with the industrial Whigs in the North because slavery is the deciding distinction between the North and the South. Now, they don't win the next election, that the Republican Party actually has a candidate in the next election, and they lose in 1856. And so Democrat James Buchanan, who is a Southerner and a slave owner, becomes president. So right now, the Southern Democrats have a majority. You can even see how they feel about the Republican platform with this political campaign poster that they created. So you can see how the Democratic platform is what's being portrayed as, for the people, the white people, whereas the Republican platform is the party that is, it's silly, it's for slaves. So you can see how it's portrayed there by the Southern Democrats. So this is really the history of the party so far. If I really have to showcase from the beginning of time to now, where the left side of the spectrum over here has always been the pro-federal government power, and the right is always anti-federal government, pro-states' rights power. You can see over time how they've transpired, where Federalists were there originally, then they kind of died off, and then they reemerged as Whigs under Henry Clay as an opposition to Jackson. Now they are Republicans. But from the beginning of time, their economy and their location, which determine their economy, has always been the underpinning thing that has influenced their viewpoints on government. So now slavery is the key issue on which party you're going to be a part of. It's not just agriculture versus industry. It is pro-slave versus anti-slave. And the Northern Democrats are our evidence for that, because now they are Republican, not Democratic. So now it comes ahead in the next election. So you can see how the election of James Buchanan, like I just said, even though the Republicans lost, you can see how that what I just said is true. The party lines of before the Democrats existed, or sorry, Republicans existed, and you just had all Democrats, versus as soon as the Republicans reemerge with the anti-slavery sentiment, you can see that the red for Fremont Republican, it's the northern states. Some of the more agricultural but still free states are holding out, but we'll see in the next election. It's so clear cut. So we're almost there. The Lecompton Constitution controversy. Say that 10 times fast. So going back to what's happening in Bleeding, Kansas, when I said that they set up two separate governments and they created two separate state constitutions, one pro-slave and one anti-slave, we're going back to that. So Lecompton, Kansas is the pro-slavery government, and they write a pro-slavery constitution. And Topeka, Kansas is where the free government and the free constitution is from. It's wildly ironic, though, because I know you might not know this at the time when you're watching this video, because we'll talk about it in period 8. But Brown v. Board of Education, the full title of that is Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That Supreme Court decision that overturns segregation in schools and therefore starts the catalyst for it to be everywhere actually begins in Topeka, Kansas. And what 100 years prior is where the free state constitution of Kansas and this mini civil war came from. So Topeka is actually a very it's historically significant for anti-slavery and pro-Black rights in a lot of ways. So I just find that really fascinating when you can see this early on that there's this connection. So both state governments who are refusing to recognize each other both submit their state constitution to the president. And he's a Southern slave-owning Democrat, and he has to decide which constitution he was going to basically sign, or he's going to approve, essentially. But he doesn't really get the chance to do that, or it's not really his responsibility or ability, I should say, to do that. It really should go through Congress. But President Buchanan took it upon himself to reject the Topeka Free State Constitution and send the pro-slave constitution to Congress for approval because of his bias. Congress immediately shuts it down because that is definitely not based on popular sovereignty. That was based on a biased president who selected the state constitution that he personally supported. So we're seeing that extremism again on the part of politicians. But Kansas is still in a full-on civil war until the popular sovereignty vote is had and it's annexed as a free state in 1858. Now some more constitutional disputes. The Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott v. Sanford is another one of those times, kind of like with the fugitive slave law, that it determines if once a slave, always a slave. However, while the fugitive slave law existed, it wasn't as challenged or as formally declared as the Dred Scott did. Dred Scott is the way that the federal government really solidified the stance on once a slave, always a slave. That's just how we interpret the fugitive slave law. It doesn't say that, but when you really look at it, you're like, isn't that kind of what that means? But they don't say it. Here, they say it. Like it is in paper. This is how the federal government, the Supreme Court specifically, is deciding. So Dred Scott is a Missouri slave whose owner moved to Wisconsin, a free state, and took him with him. And Dred Scott is arguing that now crossing into a free state territory that he is automatically free. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, who should be noted is a Southern slave-owning Democrat himself, as well as the majority of the Supreme Court justices at the time, ultimately decide that Dred Scott he didn't even have the right to sue anyone because he's not a citizen, he's property. And Congress doesn't have the right to take away someone's property due to the Fourth Amendment. And so he's allowed to remain a slave in a free state because he's property and the government can't take away property. And even though it violates that state constitution, they're saying that the Fourth Amendment trumps your state constitution. And then then they go another step further and say that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. What they're saying, because the Missouri Compromise was already repealed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Basically, what they're saying here is that it really shouldn't have been the federal government's decision to ultimately say that a state was going to be free or slave automatically, meaning that popular sovereignty really should be what should have been done and what we'll always do. Why are they saying that? Because again, as we've seen previously, Southerners are benefiting potentially from popular sovereignty. It's allowing slavery to expand in areas that were previously not on the table. All right, we are at the finish line for the road to the Civil War. We are getting into the introduction of Abraham Lincoln. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates is actually referring to the fight for the congressional seat in Illinois. So Democrat Stephen Douglas, who's the incumbent, the person who's currently residing there, the guy who wanted to build the Transcontinental Railroad, is running for re-election against new kid on the block, Republican Abraham Lincoln for Illinois congressman. Abraham Lincoln is forthcoming about his wanting his disapproval for slavery for a myriad of reasons, but he doesn't want to abolish it. He just wants to limit its expansion. There's a lot of primary sources that support that. Lincoln gives a famous speech called the House Divided speech, where he says a house divided cannot stand. And he basically is saying, like, I understand, because everyone in the country knows what's happening right now. Like, we're in a state of turmoil. Like, the country's like on fire right now. And so no one's pretending like that's not happening. So he's saying that the country's really divided right now. I am a very, like, I'm not going to inflame anything more. Like, I don't support the fact that we are hurtling towards, all this conflict. However, given that speech and given the fact that he also has publicly said that he's like a free soiler, a Republican, he doesn't want to expand slavery, Douglas takes that and runs with it and portrays Lincoln as this radical abolitionist who's going to take away slaves. And you might be wondering, well, why does Illinois care about that? Because they don't have slaves. Well, people just don't want to elect more radicals. You don't want to elect more radicals at this time. And so the other guy, Democrat Stephen Douglas, just seemed more neutral and therefore less scary at the time. And Douglas knew that, and that's what this political tactic was. But also, speaking of crazy, you have John Brown. John Brown, that's a picture of him who, that's the face of nightmares a little bit. It's nightmare fuel. He's a white Northerner, and he is a radical abolitionist who tried to start an uprising in Virginia. He tried to storm a federal arsenal, so a U.S. government weapons cache at Harper's Ferry, to arm slaves and to incentivize them to kill their owners. And it's the whole thing goes awry. But the takeaway of this, what they really want you to understand in the curriculum, is that just like the abolitionists in the antebellum era, like with something like William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, it yet again confirms the South's worst fears that citizens with political power are actively trying to fight against slavery, try to take away their slaves. That's what you have to know about John Brown, is how he inflames that Southern validation even more. Now, the final nail in the coffin and why the South secedes, the election of 1860. So the one of the final elections that you need to know for this unit, I'd argue the biggest. So you don't need to go into the entire, like, the four candidates and all that. But just to give you a little background information, just so you can understand the story, there are two Democrats, a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat, because right now they don't agree with each other on a lot of issues and they don't identify with each other. So you have a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. Well, that hurts when you're tallying up the votes by person. If you were to combine all of the Democratic votes for popular votes for president, a Democrat could have won. Because they are split, the person who now has the majority is Abraham Lincoln. And that also goes for the electoral vote. So because the Democrats are split on the issue of slavery, North v. South, it allows Abraham Lincoln to squeeze in a majority because, it's a slight majority against the split Democrats. So this is the election of 1860 turnout. So you can see it is a very by-split North v. South, slave versus non-slave issue on if you voted Republican or Democrat. The Constitutional Union Party is kind of this funny thing right here. You can see the yellow. The middle states are the one who vote for this one-time party, the Constitutional Union, and their whole thing is, let's not have a civil war. Can we just like all calm down and like everyone stop fighting? Well, the border states, the ones that were physically and literally in the middle of all of this, are the ones who are really advocating for this. Because even though they're slaveholding states, they understand that if there is a conflict, they are in trouble because they are in the middle. So the South, after the election of 1860, this is the new political reality, which makes the South, the Deep South, immediately secede when they hear that Abraham Lincoln won the election. Abraham Lincoln won this election without a single vote from the South. Not one electoral vote went to Lincoln, meaning that the South now realizes that the North, the free states, now have the political electoral majority. And without admitting more slave states immediately, like, it's game over. And they also think that Lincoln's a radical abolitionist because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in their mind, there's nothing they can do for another 4 years, and a radical abolitionist was just elected, and it's done. They just lost all the power. So they go. The Union is dissolved, the Deep South. So that is the road to the Civil War. Now let's talk about the actual Civil War. Now skip ahead. Okay, so like I said, it was only the Deep South that immediately seceded. Everything like south of this, or no, I was lying, because these ones come later. So the Deep South, like the ones down here, the more so slave owning, diehard states' rights kind of people, they're the ones who immediately secede after the election of 1860 and create the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. The northern southern states, so we call it the Upper South, didn't secede until after what occurred at Fort Sumter. This is like the shot around the world for the American Revolution. Like, this is that incident for the Civil War. So what happened at Fort Sumter in South Carolina? So Fort Sumter is a federal fort, a military fort that's off the coast of South Carolina. You can go see it today. It's like it's a historical landmark now because of the Civil War. Lincoln tried to send provisions to the troops that are stationed there, even though it is technically within a southern state that just seceded. According to Lincoln, states can't secede. It's like a parent who's like, kid ran away. They're like, you just ran away from home, but you're still part of this family. Like, what are you doing? That's kind of how Abraham Lincoln viewed the South. And so, but to the South, they're like, we're gone. You have no power over us here anymore. But Lincoln, because he firmly believes that this is still part of the Union, he goes about his business and keeps delivering, or tries to deliver, the provisions that would normally be sent to that military fort at Fort Sumter. And the South opened fires on that ship. So that is not what makes the South secede, because they're the ones who did that. It's Lincoln's reaction to Fort Sumter, which makes the rest of the South secede. So without congressional approval, Lincoln immediately, after the attack on Fort Sumter, got 75,000 volunteers. He called upon 75,000 volunteers to stop the Confederacy. Basically, he's saying, like, you are going to go fight the South, meaning that he is going to use physical force against his own people. He authorized spending for the war, and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is in regards to your a lot of your trial privileges. Like, you could just be put in prison without necessarily having to know why you're being put in prison. You just be held in prison. So he bypasses Congress and makes all of these power moves. And he claimed it was upholding public safety, that necessary and proper part of the Constitution, like that loophole. He's arguing that he's just doing the same thing. That is what makes the Upper South immediately secede, because that made it clear that Lincoln would use federal troops against their own people, or against his own people. And that's where you get Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas to also join the Confederacy. Now they're all against him. So now we have like what the full Confederacy as it is in history. The border states, the ones in blue right here, these four, I'll talk about them in a second, but they're not going anywhere. So these border states are slaveholding states. You can also see them in the checker down here. They're slaveholding states that remain within the Union, either by choice or by force. So what happened here? Lincoln understands that keeping these states are essential. For whatever reason, each 4 of these states are essential. If these 4 were to leave, population-wise, it would double the population of the Confederacy. That is how populated these slave states are compared to all the red ones. Half of the Southern population is located in just those 4 states. So we don't want to give them more people in terms of, warriors or, people for manufacturing for the war. It allows a buffer for the war, and a lot of the major waterways pass through these. And so in terms of transportation, for us to utilize during the war and fighting, we want to make sure we can secure those and the South doesn't get them. Some of them really do want to secede. Like Maryland wants to secede. It's a really slaveholding state. Like that is part of their history from the beginning, since the Chesapeake era. And they try to secede, and Lincoln puts them under martial law. He sends federal troops to be stationed there, and they are under military control for the time being. So some of them are being held there against their will. But Lincoln is going to try to keep them as happy as possible. And we'll talk about that later when it comes to slavery. So the North versus the South at this time. So the goals are, I think, very obvious: preserve the Union versus independence. But I just want to stress how many positives, how many advantages the North has over the South during this time. The North has more population, the established military, the stronger economy. They control 85% of the factories, and they control 70% of the railroads and 65% of the farmlands. They have the majority of the farmlands because they have the Northwest and those 4 slaveholding states that are the border states. They control everything. The only advantage that the South has is that passionate, they're fighting for something, and they're gonna have some really good generals. Like that is the big thing they have going from them. They have really good generals. In terms of their plan, like how to win the war, we'll talk about the Union's plan, the North plan on the next slide. The South strategy is something called cotton dependency. They're going to really hope that other countries in Europe that really depend on our cotton, or the South's cotton, is going to help them, like step in and help them win this war if they keep wanting to get the US's cotton. So we'll see how that goes. So how's the North going to succeed in this war? They have something called the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda, like a snake, they're going to snake around the South and cut them off. So they're going to wrap around and blockade all the ports in the South. They're basically taking a leaf out of Great Britain's book. Blockade them so they can't travel between each other very well, and they can't get outside help. So block them, and then block them along the lines here, and they go up through the Mississippi River. So really cut them off like a snake, snaking all the way around. And so once you can take full control of the Mississippi River, you're basically cutting the Confederacy in half. They can't connect between the half that's on this side of the Mississippi River and the half that's on this side of the Mississippi River. And then it's kind of like a game of capture the flag. All wars are back in the day. Capture the capital, which is Richmond, Virginia. So we're not going to go into all of the battles. There are there are 3 battles that you guys actually need to know. 2 are turning point battles, and 1 I would consider just like a second tier one, but still would need to know it. I'll talk about why I'm focusing on these 3 as opposed to all the ones that are in your book. So the Battle of Bull Run is not one of those 3, but just so you guys understand the story of what's happening. So the Union troops, the Northern troops, immediately organized to march into Virginia and attack. Confederate General Stonewall, this is their name, General Stonewall Jackson. His name is Stonewall. Can you Stonewall someone? You're like keeping them out. He's getting his name here because he's able to launch an effective counterattack and drive them out. This is kind of like when Great Britain is fighting the colonists, and like Lexington and Concord, they realize like, oh man, we underestimated them, and this is probably going to take a little bit more time. Very similar vibe there. So, Battle of Bull Run is kind of like that first major battle. Union General McClellan, so the Union general, tries to invade Virginia yet again, but now another general, Robert E. Lee, also forces them to retreat. It is embarrassing for the North that this happens again and again. And so McClellan even gets fired at one point because he like literally left his like battle plans out in a Union camp that is later ransacked by the Confederates, and then they see their battle plans for other battles at some point. The North is a hot mess, and the South has a lot of great just power to be had with their very strategic generals. So we get to Antietam. Antietam is that third battle that I will ask you guys to know in terms of the ranking of them. So why is Antietam so special? So Robert E. Lee, now the South is going to now launch their first major attack in Maryland, and they're hoping that this will be their Saratoga. If they can secure this victory, it'll convince Great Britain to help them. Kind of like when we won Saratoga, it helped France convince France to help us. So they're hoping that this will be their Saratoga. It does not work out. They are forced to retreat. So it's kind of their first major L. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but the South just kind of lost their one big chance to get an ally outside of the country. So Lincoln is really hesitant to touch slavery. Even though he understands that the slaves are being used to fight the war, they're what's really propping the South up right now. He's nervous about abolishing slavery because he doesn't want to abolish slavery in the border states. He wants to keep them happy and keep them part of the Union. He actually doesn't know if he constitutionally has the ability to do that. He's kind of one of those goody two shoes. Like, he's really by the book, and he just actually does not know, whether personal beliefs aside or not, if he actually has it within him constitutionally to do that. All those racial prejudices that we talked about of the North and how they didn't want to abolish it, they just wanted to limit its expansion. He feels that it would anger a lot of Northerners if he abolished it. And what if I did abolish it and then it's overturned in the next election? What would that say about the power of the presidency and all that? And, all that political stuff that is surrounding the power struggle. He just doesn't want to touch it right now. So right now, in interim, Congress passed things like the Confiscation Act, which basically allows the government, you're like, all right, if you're saying that slaves are property, this gives us the power to seize property of enemies of the state. If you are using your property to wage war against the Union, against the federal government, we're allowed to seize the property despite the Fourth Amendment. And so they are starting to seize property, seize slaves, and call them contraband, and then enlist them in the Union military to fight against the South. So this is our kind of somewhat way of emancipating slaves against the Confederate States specifically. But we can't hold off for very much longer. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 emancipates or frees all of the slaves only in the Confederacy. I cannot stress that enough. It is only in the Confederate States that they are free. The border states are exempt from this. It'll be later that they are targeted for their emancipation. And just so it's after all of this turmoil that Lincoln eventually says that it's a military necessity to cripple the South by emancipating their slaves. That's how he tries to buy the Northerners who are in opposition to this. Another reason why Antietam is considered a big war to know is because the Emancipation Proclamation is announced immediately after the North's success at Antietam. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, why that is so strategically brilliant of Abraham Lincoln. Now, does the emancipation really do anything? No. Immediately, only 1% of slaves are ever voluntarily emancipated and released by their owners. But it's a matter of principle and strategy, as I'll talk about more in a second. But a lot of these freed slaves who are either emancipated after the Emancipation Proclamation or considered contraband and taken with the Confiscation Acts start to, like I said, enlist in the Union military. And one of the most primary and inspirational examples is the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which is an all-Black regiment. It's made up of mainly freed troops who fought on behalf of the Union, and they're led by a white general. But the movie Glory with Matthew Broderick and a lot of other really famous people, we might watch it at the end of the year after the AP test because it's a really good one. But it showcases the kind of the inspiring but tragic story of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment and their ability to fight on behalf of the Union, and how that adds weight to the argument of how they should be given the same political rights to everyone else after the Civil War because they fought for them. So that's why we highlight the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. they don't successfully necessarily achieve anything during the war. There's no like major battle that they win, but it adds weight to that argument about civil rights and equality post-war. All right, so let's go back to that Antietam and cotton dependency or diplomacy and all that stuff. So, like I said, the Confederacy is tied to Great Britain. That South has always still had some kind of economic ties with Great Britain. They purchased a lot of weapons from them afterwards, or after they seceded. And Great Britain wants to make money. They were happy to oblige. However, when the South is trying to appeal to Great Britain for an allyship, it does not come for two reasons. One is the loss of Antietam. They did not prove that they have something willing to back, like they're not strong on their own, but also the strategic nature of the Emancipation Proclamation right after Antietam. Abraham Lincoln knows that that was just a super embarrassing moment and big blow to the South's appeal to Great Britain. But if you also announce the Emancipation Proclamation and say that, all these slaves are free, to the rest of the world, that just like solidified that this war is about slavery. When the South was trying to appeal to Great Britain, they were saying that, it's about tyrannical government and states' rights and power of the people. When the Emancipation Proclamation is released, now it looks like it's about slavery. And Great Britain has abolished slavery a long time ago. They don't have slaves. They don't support slavery. And so now Great Britain is like looking like, okay, you lost Antietam. And now you're looking like, wait, the reason you're fighting this war is to keep your slaves. We're not about that. We're not about to support you. So good luck with that. It was like a little like chef's kiss at the end that Abraham Lincoln, he knew what he was doing when he delivered that Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so here are the two big turning point battles that you actually do need to know. Battle of Vicksburg and Battle of Gettysburg. And wait, actually, I lied. No, yeah, I think I took off the next one. So Battle of Vicksburg. So, and you can see how these are all like they're all back to back. Emancipation Proclamation, Vicksburg, and Gettysburg are all within the same year. It's a major pivotal year for the Civil War. And so you can see this really big tide turning in favor of the Union. And so Union General Ulysses S. Grant, one of the major good generals that the North has, was able to successfully gain control of the Mississippi River. Let me move myself up so you can see it. So Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is a fort that is along the Mississippi River, and it was in control of the Confederacy for a long time. And so by overcoming Vicksburg and gaining control of that, you now control like basically the heart of the Mississippi River. So now we can use it for transportation. The South cannot, and we just slowly take over even more of it north and south of Vicksburg. So it allows that part of the Anaconda Plan to come to fruition. It's like the beginning of the end for the South, especially with the Battle of Gettysburg coming very soon after. Battle of Gettysburg was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The Confederacy is so broken and defeated after that war that they can only fight a defensive war from now on. Like they are permanently on the defense. And so, like I said, it's beginning of the end since they cannot secure any kind of assistance from Great Britain. Because Lincoln, again, is so strategic, he's so aware that the South is now at its final days, that they're crawling to the finish line. So Lincoln takes this moment, knowing that the South is crippled, to give the Gettysburg Address. It is a very, very short political speech, but it has a lot of impact. So he first dedicates the soldiers to both sides, the Union and the Confederacy. The reason why he does that is because when you read the Gettysburg Address, it is almost like praising, I don't know if that's the best word, but kind of praising the fallen soldiers of the South and the South's willingness to fight for their beliefs because they believe they're fighting a tyrannical government. He's saying he doesn't support it, but he's basically saying like, we're all fighting for the same thing, what we believe is best. And everyone on both sides is dying in what they believe is a heroic sense, but it's got to stop. Everyone's fighting for the desire to create the more perfect union that we have in the preamble of the Constitution. So what he's really doing here is he's trying to extend an olive branch to the South. Like, hey, we all know you're at the end. Like, come back. Like, open arms. Like he's really trying to maintain positive relationships with the South as much as possible. And the Gettysburg Address is evidence of that. Moment of silence for all those who bravely fought at the Battle of Shroot Farms. If you get that reference, you get brownie points. Okay, end of the war. So Ulysses Grant, so the Northern general, goes a little full force with his tactics. Because he understands that the South is pretty much at their end, it becomes what we call a war of attrition. Attrition means like heavy artillery, heavy force. Basically, if you were like dangling by a thread, he's just going to come in and like karate chop it, like just boom, hit them hard, hit them fast while they are so broken, and they will be defeated. So his war of attrition sometimes bleeds into this concept of total war, where there's really no distinction between civilians and soldiers. Everyone's an enemy, and he just blows through the South. And so like he just starts encouraging other generals to do this too. Like this is his philosophy. And a good example of this is Union General Sherman marched through the state of Georgia to capture Savannah over here at the border. But he starts here from tip to tail and just blows through the entire thing. They are destroying railroads, like just lifting them up as they go, ransacking towns, burning down crop fields, all of these things to physically and mentally just destroy the South, to beat them into submission. So that is like an example of the war of attrition really happening. But I mention this now because when we talk about Reconstruction and the nation trying to repair itself after all of this, how likely is the South going to be able to forgive the North after this? And the fact that they were already behind in a lot of ways, and now they were just physically destroyed on top of it. So we'll just kind of keep that in the back of our minds. The end of the war. So Lincoln won the re-election of 1864. It's not hard, also considering that a lot of all the Southern Democrats left Congress and created their own government. So it's only really the Republicans in the North that attend Congress meetings anymore. But what is key about this election is he chooses a new vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern slave-owning Democrat who is loyal to the federal government. He's loyal to the Union. He's a Southerner, but he doesn't agree with disunion or disloyalty. He said that the secession was unconstitutional, it's unpatriotic, it's he doesn't support it. So this is another strategic move by Abraham Lincoln to show like, hey, if we can get along as president and vice president, the North and the South, like two symbols, can get along like this, so can the rest of the country. It was very strategic. Now, General Ulysses S. Grant's forces are able to capture the capital of Richmond, Virginia, in the South, and very shortly after, we're able to secure a surrender from General Lee at the Appomattox Courthouse in the South. So the Civil War is now at an end, but that is really not where the story ends, because the fighting, the physical fighting, has now stopped. The conflict between the North and the South is not over, because now we have to enter the stage of Reconstruction. How do we physically and mentally build the country back together? And who gets to decide that? There's a lot of compromises that have to be had. There's a lot of bad blood still, because who's going to just forget that we just fought the war against each other? Like, there's a lot of heatedness still between the two. And on top of it, Abraham Lincoln's assassinated. So he actually never even got to see the finale of the Civil War. 1 month before the actual surrender by Robert E. Lee, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, and then was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth shortly after that. And so in his second inaugural address, he kind of gave that same vibe to the Gettysburg Address as we are all one country. We all need to welcome each other back with open arms. But he did not foresee him dying, especially when he chose his VP. So now let's proceed understanding that we do not have the benevolent Northern Republican president anymore. We have, we'll see what type of personality he is, but a Southern slave-owning Democrat as president during Reconstruction. All right, skip this for a second. All right, so these are some activities we're going to do in class about reevaluating Lincoln's legacy. And we're going to move forward to Reconstruction. So, all right, we got them back. South's back. Now what? How is the South going to rebuild its literally and physically shattered society and economy after 4 years of pure economic hardship and war? What do we do with the 4 million freed slaves? Should the federal government help the freed slaves? How should the Confederate States be treated upon reentry, like they never left or conquered territory? Under what conditions would the Confederates be fully allowed back into the Union? And who has the authority to answer any of these questions to begin with during Reconstruction? Is it a presidential issue, Congress, popular sovereignty? Like, what are we doing here? So there is a lot of issues on the table. And then even the question of who should decide those issues is also on the table. It's a hot mess. So same old problems that existed before the Civil War still exist now. Still those economic differences. We still have the regional party differences. So let's just see what happens. So Reconstruction is really divided into 3 rounds, as kind of historians have marked it in today's time. Each round is based off of, like, in retrospect, this is like in hindsight as historians have analyzed this. Each round is called that round based on who's really calling the shots in that round. So the first round is presidential Reconstruction. It's kind of in the hands of the presidents to decide what's happening with the rest of the country. Then it moves to Congress, and then it moves to Southern. And we'll talk about why it feels like it's changing hands as time goes on. Okay, so what do we mean by Reconstruction? Like I said, the physical, emotional, mental rebuilding of the country and bringing back the North and the South together into one union, one country. So round 1, presidential Reconstruction. So before Lincoln was assassinated, he knew the end was in sight. He knew that the end of the Civil War was almost there. So he put forth his own plan for Reconstruction. It was called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. The word amnesty can really denote what the vibe of this act was. Amnesty means pardon. And so you can even see in the title of it, he's trying to extend this sense of, like I said, olive branch continuously to the South. He would grant a full pardon to anyone, any Confederates who would, 1, take an oath of allegiance to the Union and the Constitution and promise to never revolt again. And 2, you have to rewrite your state constitution to include the 13th Amendment, which is the emancipation of slaves. So the 13th Amendment here is now being added to the Constitution. So everywhere, even border states, need to rewrite their Constitution now to abolish slavery. Now, some people lovingly refer to this as the 10% plan, but that only refers to the oath portion. The 10% plan refers to the fact that only 10% of the state, the voting population, it's even lower, that's not even women. Only 10% of the voting population has to take the oath of loyalty for the entire state to be welcomed back into the Union. That means you could have 90% of the rest of the state giving you the middle finger on the way back in, and they would still need to be accepted back in, according to Lincoln. Not everyone is going to agree. A lot of people disagree with Lincoln's leniency. That is the best word to describe this plan. It is so lenient. The bar is so stinking low to allow the South to come back. But that's the point. He just wants them to come back. We need to start the healing process. But again, he's assassinated. That's not the plan we get. So what happens? The Republicans in Congress have a very different idea. Radical Republicans is the name of the group of Republicans who were in Congress before the Civil War, during the Civil War. We're really fighting, the ones fighting and orchestrating all this, the fighting against the South. They want their pound of flesh from the South. They are extremists who believe that the Confederates were treacherous and treasonous, and they need to be punished. And so they are ready to reassert their dominance over the South. They want to make them bleed and kind of beg to come back and make it harder. So they proposed the Wade Davis bill, which would up that 10% to 50, essentially. And anyone who was a in the part of the Confederate government. So you were just a small town farmer, didn't actually participate, had no political party, political, stake in the war to begin with. You're fine. You can vote. But all of the people who had some kind of political power in the Confederacy are not allowed to weigh in on their state's new constitution. Lincoln pocket vetoed this. So Congress went through all of Congress to wind up on his desk, and he pocket vetoed it. A pocket veto is when a president doesn't actively veto something. They let it sit on their desk until it reaches its expiration date, and then it vetoes or it dies by natural causes. The reason why he lets that happen is because he is afraid of taking a stance, well, one against his own party, possibly. The name of the game for Lincoln is to not upset people. He just wants everyone to come back with open arms. And he understands that the Wade Davis bill is the pound of flesh that the Republican Party wants. And he just does not want to do that. But the radical Republicans in Congress do pass one super successful thing during Reconstruction. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is a welfare agency, a really successful welfare agency. So again, set up by the federal government and supported by tax dollars and everything. So even like the Southern taxes, once they get readmitted, go towards the Freedmen's Bureau, which is funny. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a welfare agency that provides food, shelter, and medical assistance to the freed slaves. But one of their absolute biggest achievements is the education. They set up schools for all the freed slaves, over 3,000 schools for freedmen to help them get literacy skills and job training. And so they, again, because that's like the key to success, right? Like that's why like your schooling now is so indicative of future success because it opens up so many doors. And so their education reforms for freed slaves are really pivotal in terms of allowing freedmen and Black Americans to gain a lot more access to resources and achieve more equality later on. Another kind of funny thing about this is that the land that was given to some of these freed slaves is land that was previously confiscated from ex-Confederates. So these radical Republicans took the land away from ex-Confederates and gave it to their slaves so they can start over and have their own farms. This will later be undone by the President Johnson, but we'll talk about that later. This is a political advertisement from the time about the Freedmen's Bureau. It says, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness, meaning like when you're idle, you're not moving, like your car is an idle, at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the president, and you protect the white man. Clearly from the POV of a Southern Democrat, does not support the Freedmen's Bureau. They are highlighting that they feel like this is undemocratic because the president vetoed it twice, but the Congress is able to keep it going. So they're just trying to highlight like this is not what we want, sort of thing, and just trying to associate it with this is for African Americans, not for citizens. So President Johnson becomes the absolute worst. So disenfranchisement means like the loss of political power. Initially, he doesn't really do anything as Congress, the radical Republicans in Congress, are disenfranchising the former leaders of the Confederacy. Part of it also might be because, fun fact, he grew up poor in the South, and he also wasn't a huge fan of a lot of the ex-Confederates because a lot of them were like these like old rich white guys that kind of looked down on people like him when he was younger. So there might have been a little bias there. But as states are rewriting their state constitutions to allow Black Americans to become citizens, none of them are going past that. None of them are giving them the right to vote or anything like that. And then Johnson it feels like he starts to switch his allegiance to the South. Even though initially he was loyal to Lincoln and loyal to the Union, now when he's calling the shots, he does not stop that ex-Confederates are actually running for re-election in the South, even though the Congress was passing those disenfranchisement laws that would take away the ability for them to hold office, he actually goes and pardons a lot of them so they can run for re-election. And so basically all of these Southern Democrats, Southern congressmen, who became major political leaders in the Confederacy, all go back to their former seats. Key example, Alexander Stephens, former vice president of the Confederacy, was reelected to his senator seat in Georgia because he was pardoned by the president. So the radical Republicans in Congress, who they didn't fully support this VP pick of Abraham Lincoln to begin with, are extremely upset about it right now. Now they have a new enemy. On top of it, the southern states start passing what's called black codes. Black codes are kind of like what replaces the slave codes. So if you remember that, you can kind of understand what black codes are. They're just to restrict the former slaves. So it prohibits them from renting or owning their own land, borrowing money to have their own or to get their own land. And we'll talk about the semi-bondage contract labor system more in a little bit. But they also pass laws that if you are jobless, you are considered a vagrant and can be put in prison. And President Johnson will continuously veto bills that try to strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau. He will veto the radical Republicans' attempts to block the black codes. So basically, he's saying that the black codes should be able to exist. All around, it feels like he is the opposite of what Lincoln was hoping for and intending. There's just so much more building tension now between the North versus the South over Reconstruction, because we have a leader who seems to be very biased towards the South. So round 2, this is congressional Reconstruction. So you can understand why congressional Reconstruction is now happening, because they are fed up with Johnson. They are so inflamed right now that they're like, all right, screw you. We're rallying and we're now going to try to set the standard. Like we're gonna try to do what we want to do. So the increasingly radicalness because of Johnson's continuous vetoes and all that stuff and what's happening in the South, 2 main radical Republicans are like the mouthpiece. Charles Sumner from the Brooks-Sumner incident on the road to the Civil War, and Thaddeus Stevens. So their goal is now to punish the South, protect the freedmen, and if you can get rid of Johnson, get rid of Johnson. And so the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. So this is one that's formally officially passed. The 14th Amendment is what allows all of the freed slaves to become citizens. I know a lot of people kind of mix up 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, 15th, which allows the right to vote. But think of it in logical order. Can you vote if you're not a citizen? Well, no. So citizenship has to come before voting. Well, can you be a citizen if you're a slave? No. So abolishing slavery has to come first. They have to come in that order. So 13th, 14th, 15th are called the Reconstruction Amendments, and they are abolishing slavery, granting citizenship, and the right to vote. The 14th Amendment is the first time that it says that that states are required to protect individual rights. I know we have that in the Constitution. That's the Bill of Rights. But this is the first time that they're putting on the states that it needs to be in every state constitution to guarantee this specific right in their state, which is equal protection of the law and the right to vote. Johnson keeps trying to veto all these, but the Republican majority just keeps pushing them through. They have had it with him. So Congress is going to become a little bit more hostile. And don't hate me for the poorly pictured part of Trump. I made this PowerPoint a long time ago, and it's just kind of ironic that he's still on this slide about impeachment. So we'll get to that when we get to period 9. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is just something else that kind of happens in the background. They split, to show the extremeness of the Northern Republicans, they split the South into 5 different military districts. It's almost like Hunger Games style. And they have military occupation of each of these 5 districts until all of Reconstruction is done. Again, until they accept their pound of flesh. Johnson tries to veto it. They keep overturning the veto. Johnson's President Johnson keeps trying to, like, what they call fear mongering, trying to, like, give these impassioned speeches about the Africanized South, meaning that the slaves are going to be taking over the South. And the Republicans are very guilty of what they call waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt is coded meaning that, like, you're constantly reminding the South of the war. So basically, anytime that someone like a Southerner tries to say anything, the North is like, hey, remember that time you started the Civil War? Sit down. That's what that means. But a political mess arises when President Johnson is impeached. Remember, impeached just means investigated. It does not mean removal. Those are two different things. You have to be impeached before you're getting removed. No president has ever been removed. It's been a couple that have been close. We'll talk about all those times, but this is the first time. So Johnson is impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, he's being investigated for violating this rule that a congressman has tenure, kind of like how teachers have tenure. Once you've been there for so long, it's a little harder to get rid of you. You have to, you're constantly being evaluated, and you can be fired, but there's a little bit more job security. You can't just be like let go the next day. So it's a little different from other jobs. Congressmen have a very similar thing. So he violated the Tenure of Office Act by just firing someone that he didn't like. So he's impeached. It goes to the vote on if he's going to be removed, and he falls one vote short of being removed from office. Why? If the radical Republicans have the majority, it should have been so easy for them to get rid of him. So why are they holding out? It's because even though a lot of them don't like him, a lot of them are very nervous to start that precedent of just impeaching and removing a president because politically you don't agree with them. They don't want to start that precedent. It's only happened a few times throughout the entire history where someone's been impeached and there's been a vote to remove. Only a couple times, 3. Because one person quit before that happened, before the vote actually happened. But yeah, they were just too afraid to start that precedent. They could have, they didn't. All right, so we said 15th Amendment, all male U.S. citizens now have the right to vote despite race. Landmark case or landmark achievement for the civil rights movement, because right to vote is like, again, your political voice, and like it's like equivalent of being a citizen and a person in this country is really having it's a fundamental right, the right to vote. Even if people today don't take it, we don't talk about it nearly to that same extent and put it as much on a pedestal as we have in the past. Back in the day, that's huge. That's really huge. And another huge landmark civil rights legislation that you do need to know, a golden vocab term, is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. You do need to know the year because there will be other civil rights acts in history. Kind of like the Treaty of Paris things, there's multiple civil rights acts. There's a couple second semester you'll need to know. So Civil Rights Act of 1875. This grants equal accommodation in public places. It's not fully enforced, though. Is we're going to start getting Jim Crow stuff later. But basically said that public places, Black and white people should have equal accommodations. But it's not going to be as enforced. We'll talk about a little bit why that is later. Lastly, there's something called carpetbaggers. I mention these things now because we're almost at the end. And we're going to go immediately into period 6, which is all about the Second Industrial Revolution, all this kind of stuff. But race relations are still going to be there. Political relations, like between the two parties, are still going to be there. But there are things that are happening now that will affect us in the next unit. And carpetbaggers is one of them. Carpetbaggers are an unflattering nickname to Northerners who basically took advantage of the South during their era of Reconstruction. While they were rebuilding, you have these like businessmen or politicians, but mainly businessmen, who are taking advantage of the Southern's need to rebuild. And so they are like investing in Southern businesses, but kind of like in a predatory way. And so when we talk about the Second Industrial Revolution in the beginning of period 6, you're going to realize that the North is really controlling the South. They're almost puppeteering it at this point. And it's because they're taking advantage of them during this time. So carpetbaggers is this joke name for a carpetbagger, like a knapsack that you're hopping the border and you're going down there and you're like taking advantage of them. Okay, the end of Reconstruction. So now we're in the final round, which we call Southern Reconstruction. So again, we're going to go into this a little more in the next unit, but one of the things that starts happening towards the end of Reconstruction is that it starts to lose steam. The Northern Republicans start to, I won't say not care as much, but kind of the plight of the Southerners, Southern freedmen, the former slaves. And it's because they're starting to go through their second industrial revolution, and they're going to start making a lot of money and have a lot of internal progress. And a lot of them are facing a lot of distractions, and they're going to start forgetting about the Reconstruction in general. That's honestly what happens. So the end of this unit and the beginning of the next unit are going to really overlap. So you have the Northern Republicans who are starting to be distracted with their own economic gains, and the Southerners who are getting so fed up with the radical Republicans passing all of these things that we just talked about that now they're incentivized to, get up and start doing stuff. So what have the freed slaves been doing? A lot of them are migrating to the north if they can, and to western cities. So to northern western cities, because again, cities are where you can be more accepted, hopefully, where job opportunities are. So there's this great migration of people going north. But it's hard. It takes money to uproot your entire life and afford to go somewhere. So a lot of them have to stay exactly where they are. And one of the last major vocab terms for this unit is sharecropping. Sharecropping is this new contract labor system. It's essentially slavery 2.0. So imagine you're a freed slave after the Civil War. Well, you need a job now. Where are all the job opportunities after the Civil War in the South? Back on the plantations where all of the slaves were just emancipated. So it creates this terrible condition where the former slaves have to go back to their slave owners for jobs. And the contract system they work out is called sharecropping, where they are technically like renting a little portion of the plantation to farm, but the cost of like the rent for that area, that little plot, is so much. It's insurmountable to the amount of money they'll actually make. So they are constantly indebted to the plantation owner. So you can see how this is basically putting them in bondage yet again. It's this new form of economic slavery. They've kind of weaponized the economy against them still, the need for jobs, and where the only job opportunities are if they're too poor to move north, and they're unskilled, and they don't have the literacy that they needed. So they're just kind of stuck. They're pigeonholed here. And unfortunately, when President Johnson pardoned a lot of the Southern Confederates, a lot of them who were kind of the wealthy plantation owners in the South, he gave them back their land. And so it kind of goes back to how it was before the Civil War. This is also where we get, if you guys are familiar with like the Black Lives Matter movement a couple years ago, well, it's still going, but its peak was back in 2020. You might have been familiar with a lot of the, a big part of the movement, which was like anti-policing, and the people talking, there's a lot of buzzwords that kind of went along with like the prison system and why Black Lives Matter was fighting against it. It actually is because the current prison system has its roots in Reconstruction. The current prison system was set up as a convict leasing system during Reconstruction. So unfortunately, it has very racist roots. So the 14th Amendment, that allows protection under the law for everyone to be equal, does not protect prisoners. So if you can get a former slave, a freed person in jail for whatever reason, then plantation owners can use them as free labor. So what you see starting during this time is police forces that were being created, that were getting an abundance of former slaves into prison for whatever reasons, loitering, vagrancy, debtor's prison, whatever it is. And then as soon as you got them into prison, you were able to enslave them again. They lost the right to vote. They were not protected under the law anymore, and you could use them as free labor. All right, here's the end. The end of Reconstruction, totally. So as radical Republicans are starting to become disconnected with Reconstruction and pull out of the South, conservative Democrats are slowly rising and taking back what they feel like is theirs. That's where we get this term redeemers. Redeemers are Southern Democrats who want to rebuild the South to its like former glory. They believed in states' rights. They want to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau. They believe in white supremacy. This is where we get the KKK being created. We'll talk about that a lot more in period 6. The Force Acts is kind of the last stand of the radical Republicans, where they pass the Force Acts, which allows the government to use federal force to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments in the South. But again, as the radical Republicans are getting distracted, they don't really follow up on it. And so everyone's just tired. Everyone's tired or has a new agenda other than Reconstruction or helping the former slaves or whatever it is. And so it comes to a head in the next election. And this is the final election that you'll need to know for this unit or for this semester. The election of 1877 actually ends Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877, sometimes also called the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. Hayes and Tilden are the two people who are running for president in the election of 1876. Southern Democrat Tilden wins the popular vote, but there's contested electoral votes. So now we're saying that this is like the next time. There's only like the second or third time this happened. We well, kind of depends, because with Jackson, it happened. That was the first time that the the popular vote didn't line up. But the time before that was they were just split electoral votes, and so that I had to go to the House of Representatives to decide. So this is the first time that like officially popular vote and electoral vote didn't match, and that the opposite person became president. So Southern Democrat Tilden wins the popular vote, but there's contested electoral votes. And so in this kind of like hoopla of like trying to allow the Electoral College to kind of like redo their stuff, honestly, everyone starts to call it quits, and they strike a deal. Congress strikes a deal where Republican Hayes will become president, even though Tilden, the Democrat, won the popular vote. But Hayes has to agree to immediately end Reconstruction, pull out all of the military out of the South, and just call it quits. And that's the deal. The radical Republicans in Congress, not so radical anymore. They're done. They allow Reconstruction just to end. And that's where it's at right now. I mean, there has been a lot of gains for the former slaves. I mean, they're not slaves anymore. They, on paper, by constitutional law, have the right to vote. It's not really going to be upheld. They're not really being protected. They have things like the KKK. They're really not in a good spot. But Reconstruction has officially ended. So there's no more help being received by Congress. That's not the priority anymore. So there's nothing else you need to know about President Hayes. He does nothing else that we'll ever talk about. It's literally just his election is the bargaining chip for Southerners to be like, please just end Reconstruction. We are done with this. And that's the end. Then we go into period 6 after this and kind of talk about the aftermath of everything that happened, and go into the Industrial Revolution that pulled the Republicans' attention elsewhere. But yeah, that's about it. So let me know if you have any questions, and I hope that was helpful for you guys. Bye.